take a long time to get this kind of series finished. And one thinks about it about 3/4 of the way through and say, now, why did I do this? Because it is a lot of work, but actually it's also a great pleasure because I am able to, with my team, which is fairly substantial and large, to deliver material about our community that otherwise would be hidden and probably would be lost forever. History must be written, otherwise it's just the past, and it just goes away into the dustbin of history, exactly the dustbin of the past, because history is written or spoken or or televised, something like that, to make it available to all sorts of people. And that was the key to this series, is that there are lots of people who wouldn't necessarily read books about Lawrence history. So we have made these books scholarly, and we've made these books beautiful, and we've made these books thorough and written by experts in various fields. I've collected them and gotten them to write, and I have a whole team of copy editors and editors to make this work. So it takes a lot of time, and that's why maybe I've been working on it for 25 years in my head, but it wasn't until I retired from KU for the second time that I thought, and I was 70 years old in 2014, I thought if I reached the age of 80 and have done nothing but gone fishing, I will be very proud of myself for having given up that time, especially since I had worked with people who worked on their projects as architects until they're in their 90s. So that's why I took this up again, not just for me, but mostly for people like you who would be interested in coming to a lecture about Florence. Now, someplace I have, here are my copies. And this is the first volume of Embattled Lawrence. And it came out in 2001. And it was about 460 pages. And Barbara Watkins was my co-editor. She is not well enough to work on this extended project, but she and I worked very closely together. And the way this happened is because in 1997, the Humanities Department recruited me to teach a course on the history of Lawrence called Biography of the City, Lawrence. These biographies had been taught about Moscow, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Rome, wherever, but nobody had thought about maybe we ought to talk about the place where we live. And it had always been my view that if we don't know where we live, we don't really know who we are, and maybe we don't even know where we are. And so part of this came out of my interest in vernacular architecture. I taught the history of American architecture in the School of Architecture, but mostly history of architecture is Eurocentric in schools of architecture. It's ancient, medieval, modern. It's all about Europe, almost entirely. So even after I got my PhD, I went back and got another master's degree that specialized me in American architecture, so I could introduce that to the school. And so that students, when they walked out of the door of Marvin Hall and down to Old West Lawrence or East Lawrence, they would know what those buildings were all about. They could read those buildings and understand them. Otherwise, they really didn't know where they were. So I taught this course in 1997. We didn't have a reader, so I had to scrape the readings together from all sorts of places and copy them all for the students and get them ready. We had 80 students. 80 students. They came at night. We had over 1,000 students on Channel 6. That's how interested people were in Lawrence in their own city. And so that was a great semester. And I thought, well, after that, I'll put together an anthology so for the next professor who wants to teach the history of Lawrence, that professor will have something to use to give to students. Well, nobody ever taught it again. And I went on to Kentucky, and I came back, and I just never taught it again. And so it was useful at one point, but not as useful as I thought it would be, and it didn't cover as much of the material about the history of Lawrence as I thought it should have. So that in 2017, I took the bold step to start a second volume. Where is that second volume? Right here. This is volume 2. Now, volume 2 is a beauty. It's almost 500 pages. It has 350 photos. It's written with my help and work by about 35 different writers. So this is not a Dennis Domer history. This is a community history. So that you hear many voices. It isn't just through my prism, because I have certain ideas that I probably am biased in certain ways, and I wanted many more people to have a chance to write this book with me. So if you look at this book, it's meant to be a work of art. And I'm going to now start showing a little bit about these works of art that are coming up. And let's see if I can get this one to go. Yes. After I did volume 2, people said, well, where's volume 1? Volume 1 has been sold out and out of print for 15 years. And you can get them for $600 a piece on Amazon. But phenomenal, nobody's that crazy. Maybe some, but I don't think they're here. And I wouldn't recommend it for $600, but I will show a little bit more about this. But because it wasn't available since September of last year, it's now taken 9 months. We're down to the end of the copy editing. I've worked on this second edition. This is the cover, the new cover for the second edition. You can see it's quite different than the first edition. So it is a second edition. And we did add articles, and we added 120 photos. And we also redesigned it. New paper, new covers, new printer, new team put it together, new editors. And this first volume is called Embattled, Lawrence, Conflict and Community. And this is our representation of conflict. This is about a 1966 Civil Rights March. Up from 9th Street, you can see this is St. Luke's AME Church, and this is Tensie Oldfather marching right along with everybody else. And so this is our representation of conflict. Our representation on the back cover, wrong way, back cover is the Campanile. We were most together after World War II, going into World War II as a community. We all believed in the same thing, and we all did our duty. And several hundred young men died from KU. And in 1950, this Campanile was put up. Everything was there except for the bronze doors, which didn't get on until 1955. Poco Fraser did those with Eldon Teft, his student. And this is a place that is actually magical. It's actually supposed to be reverential, but it also is joyful because the students go through there, and when they graduate, they yell when they go through this, perhaps yelling to those students who died so many years ago to remember them, and they would remember, they would remember our students too. So the Campanile is very serene and represents our community coming together. It doesn't just represent getting drunk that night after graduation. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. Now, we also did some things that were designed differently. We put in end papers. The end papers, you can see when you open up the book, the end papers come at the beginning of the book and at the end of the book. And so they are supposed to demonstrate something about the content and the message and the spirit of the book. And this particular set of end papers, I think I can now, you know where they are. These end papers, these end papers were drawn by Ann Patterson. I don't know if you know Ann Patterson. She's in the School of Architecture, and she's a great illustrator. And what she did was do what I wanted to do, which was to draw the background, which is the landscape and the buildings upon which we carry out our lives, with which we carry out our lives, and then put the people in it is a kind of a separate layer. And you'll see all this when you get to the book. I'm sure you'll want to buy it. By the way, because we do this as volunteers, and my time doesn't count at all for anything money, we can create these books for about $60,000. And we sell them for $40 a piece, which is $15 less than they cost. But we raise all the money, so Watkins gets it all in profit, or the Raven gets it all in profit. So it really does a good job of supporting these two institutions. So this is the front end paper, and the back end paper ends up with another sharpshooter, William Burroughs. He was about as radical as John Brown. And it's still against the same background, but with different people and different issues. And you can see here's Tennessee Oldfather right in the middle of it. So this sets the tone, and it also demonstrates my view that books need to be works of art. They need to be beautiful. They need to be attractive. They need to have a lot of photography. They need to be scholarly. We don't do endnotes, we do footnotes the way they should be done. And so this suggests that there's something really special to this book, and I think that there is. So those are the end papers to the first one. Now, you saw this second volume, that's the front page of it. These two guys are Haskell Indian football players, and they just come out of the White House in 1923 because they beat the University of Minnesota 7-0. Little old Haskell beat big old University of Minnesota 7-0. And Haskell was famous for its athletes, particularly football players and track. Well, Billy Mills, you've heard of him. He won the gold medal, 10,000 meters in 1968, I believe. So these two have just come out of the White House. And the end papers for this were done by John Gaunt. John Gaunt is the retired dean of the School of Architecture, a masterful illustrator. And you can see that what he tried to do was to draw the timeline in visual form of our history. So he starts with the burning in 1856 of the Free State Hotel. Sheriff Jones came in with his posses from South Carolina and Georgia, the slavers, and they eventually were able to burn down that. And it goes through here in 1863. Quantrill burned down the Eldridge Hotel again. Of course, in the 1880s, we had some lynchings here. And here we're showing that. The Douglas County had a strong group of KKK people, and we had it at KU too, the Cuckoo Club, KU Club. I'll show some of those photos, but they also marched down Jayhawk Boulevard. So that's what happened. And then he ends it in 1929 with the red rock that was in Robinson Park that's now been moved. So that's the front end paper. And the back end paper then goes on with Haskell, the Children's Cemetery, the Red Light District in East Lawrence, the demonstrations about Vietnam, and the burning of the Kansas Union. So fire to fire to fire. It's a very beautiful set of drawings. And just that alone, I think you should be interested in. Now, this is the third volume that I'm working on right now, Building Lawrence, and we should have that done in about a year, but we're about halfway done now. So that should be the third volume. And John Gahn has already done the end papers there. Building Lawrence. I call this the genesis of Lawrence. Look at all that energy and steam that's coming off of Lawrence in its building process. Here's Lawrence underneath, a clear blue, clear white sky above it, lots of energy. We're still building Lawrence. In fact, we're going to be building Lawrence for a very long time. And so this is called, for me, the genesis. You can see that here are the elevator there, and up here is the tower. You know the tower on Massachusetts Street, the Southwestern Bell Tower? Well, that's right there too, and that's very controversial. I always pick controversial subjects because there's no reason to feed you warm milk, right? You already know about that. So we try to get right into the thick of it, and so John has done that for us. Then the fourth volume is People and Places, which is basically, let me stand out of your way. I don't want to get in your way. Basically, it is a photo album. There are hundreds and hundreds of collections at the Spencer Research Library that haven't even been opened. So I've worked 3 summers already there. And when I first started there, I went in and said, I want to look at photo collections of Lawrence. And the librarian said, well, okay, what do you want? And I said, everything. Everything, because I didn't know what was there, and nobody knew what is there, and I still don't know what is there, so we have plenty of time to work on this. But People and Places is what we're all about, basically. Now, so I think I'll just start off with the new volume, the second edition, which will be out, I think, in June or early July. So this is our front cover, and there are about 8 themes I'm going to be talking about. One of them is the New England Immigrant Aid Society. Another one is Haskell. Another one is race. I'll get to them. Another one is downtown. Another one is Albemarle. You live somewhere here in Albemarle, I think. And so I'll go through very quickly now, because I think I only have about 35 minutes left before I have to stop. And we never get done, so don't expect there to be an ending here. It will just be a chop off, right? And he's going to send up the red flag when it's time. Okay, so this is the new volume 1, second edition. I'm just going to start off with some of the characters. First of all, I would like to say this, is that Lawrence is a place of migrants. Almost nobody was born here and grew up here. This guy did, right here, Rick Mitchell. How many of you people were born in Lawrence? 2 people. 2 people. The rest of us migrated in. So did everybody who came in 1854. Even the Kaw Indians didn't come here until the late 18th century. The only historical Indians we have in Kansas were the Wichita. So everybody moved in here. We're all from somewhere else. And I think that's particularly important to remember in this time of controversy about immigration, migration, and who belongs here and who doesn't belong here. We perhaps from the very beginning believed that we all belonged here one way or another, and I don't see you fighting each other, so you're all okay out there as a part of this group. Well, this is Amos Lawrence. Amos Lawrence, where was he from? He was from Groton, Massachusetts. He was a Harvard graduate, 1835 Harvard graduate. He became very wealthy. He had in a factory that made knitted clothing. And he was an avid abolitionist. And so he's the namesake because he paid for people to come. Where were they going to? They didn't know what Kansas was like. What were they going to live? How are they going to do it? They didn't know, but they were courageous. And Amos Lawrence didn't come to Lawrence until 1884, and he was only here about 3 or 4 days because he was ill. He died in 1888. So Amos Lawrence was a migrant in and a migrant out, kind of like the bird flew over, practically, for him. But he is a very, very important character in our past. Now, who's next? Charles Robinson. Charles Robinson also came from Massachusetts. He brought Sarah with him, his second wife. Charles Robinson was a medical doctor. He was the first governor of the state of Kansas. There were other governors of the territory, but he was the first governor of the state of Kansas. He was the superintendent of Haskell Institute, which later became Haskell Indian Nations University. So Charles Robinson was a very important man in a migrant in our past. Who was this? Salone O. Thatcher. Anybody heard of Salone O. Thatcher? Salone O. Thatcher and Mr. Ludington built 1613 Tennessee down there with the big tower. You know, on where Terry Reardon lives now, down Tennessee. It's got a big tower there on the west side of the road. That's Salone Thatcher's house. He was a lawyer, and he came from Pennsylvania, I believe, and he was a member of the Wyandotte Convention, the Constitutional Convention. He wrote the Topeka Constitution for the state of Kansas. And so what I think was so important was that he was on the founding group who set up the University of Kansas. And he insisted that we admit women from day one to the University of Kansas. And I made sure that his photo got into this second edition, because that was a real step forward. That was very progressive. And so we've had women in our university ever since 1865. So Salone O. Thatcher, somebody we should remember. Richard Cordley. Richard Cordley came here in 1857. He was the first minister of the Plymouth Congregational Church on Vermont. And he came from England. And he died in 1907. He wrote the first history of Lawrence in 1895. Got a beautiful stone out at Oak Hill Cemetery. Richard Cordley. And you know who was really after Richard Cordley in August 21, 1863? Quantrill was after him, because he was a very big, strong abolitionist, and he was a leader of the city. And it was just like he was a target, but they didn't get him. They didn't get him. They didn't get a lot of their targets. The other target that I think he's coming up right here. No, not yet. Yes. This is John Spear. John Spear came in 1855, set up the Kansas Tribune newspaper in Topeka, and then sold it out and came to Lawrence and set up the Kansas Republican newspaper in Lawrence. His two of his sons were killed in the Quantrill's raid, and Quantrill was after him too, but they didn't get him. But they got his children. Pretty tough, huh? This is the map that Major David Starr Hoyt carried with him near Willow Springs in 1856, shortly after Sheriff Jones destroyed the Free State Hotel. He had just been negotiating with the slavers in Lecompton. He was on his way to Willow Springs. They ambushed him and killed him. David Hoyt was about 35. He was in the Mexican-American War. He was in every major battle. And these are the bloodstains on that map that he had, because this was, after all, bloody Kansas. And here's a good example of blood that was shed for us. John Brown. Yeah. John Brown. He came from, I can't sure I can remember exactly, but I believe it was Connecticut. But John Brown, as soon as he heard about Kansas, he got out here right away. And he was involved especially after the Sheriff Jones was destroyed the hotel. He got involved quickly in the battles. He was at the Battle of Blackjack. He was at the Battle of Osawatomie. He was hanged for his views in West Virginia. And he was a radical too. In fact, this man is probably the only white man in the history of black history in the United States that is totally endeared by the black people. They love John Brown because his body was moldering in the grave. You remember that song? And he died for them and for us. John Brown. This is John Stewart. Reverend John Stewart. He had what they call Stewart's Fort down on the Wakarusa River, and it was an underground railroad station. And so he fought strongly for people who were trying to escape slavery into Nebraska, basically. That was the closest place. John Stewart. He was from England. There he is again right here, John Stewart. This is the Immortal 10. They saved John Doy, Dr. John Doy. He was captured by the slavers in western Missouri, and he was imprisoned in St. Joe. And they went to St. Joe secretly and stole John Doy away from that jail. So all of these people should be named and are from somewhere else. James Lane, you've heard of him. Senator James Lane. He was the first Jayhawker. He was the Brigadier General of the Union. But before he was appointed that in 1861, at the start of the Civil War, he was basically a raider like William Quantrill, except on our side. Because they raided all of western Missouri and basically did the same thing over there that Quantrill did here. So let's get that one straight. I mean, there was a lot of vicious killing on both sides. And we revere James Lane, who was the first senator, and in the end, he's a warrior. And when the Civil War was over, he didn't have a war, and he committed suicide because he didn't have anything that he thought was important to do. But he was the first Jayhawk. His Jayhawkers wore long red stockings, and they were called red legs. And that's where the Jayhawk gets the red legs, you know, right there. So here's the Jayhawk, and we're still fighting the Missouri's students on the battlefield of football and basketball and track. And I don't think there's much love lost yet. No. Here's the red legs. Here is a drawing of the Jayhawkers raiding western Missouri. You can see it was the same thing. It was the same thing that was going on. This was, after all, a battle for freedom. And people like John Brown were going to die for freedom. And so many people did. This is Robert Miller. He came from South Carolina. His son came early on and set up the Free State Press. He came in 1858. His house and his homestead is still out on 19th Street, just past Haskell. They're on the hill on the right side of the road. It's still there. The oldest privy, standing privy in Lawrence, is still there in 1858. It's a brick privy. You know what they call brick privies. So anyway, he came. He came. I think somebody else will know what that's referring to. And he was a very successful farmer and a strong abolitionist. And people like this, he was in South Carolina. He was tarred and feathered for his views on abolition. So he really had to leave. And so he became a hero here along with his son. And if you want to see the homestead, it's still out there. Here's the house. When Quantrill's came along with this, gotta have a little lozenge here. When Quantrill came into Lawrence, he sent one of his people right up here. And Miller sent his daughter to the front porch to talk to this guy because they were from the South. They treated women with special decorum. And Quantrill was in Lawrence in the 1850s, long before he was here in 1863. His name was Charlie Hart, and he was a school teacher. He staked out Lawrence, knew it well. And he was treated very well. And he instructed his raiders not to kill these people. The one place that he did want to go to was the Eldridge House, which was the symbol of freedom. And his most memorable command was, go to the hotel. Go to the hotel, which they did go to the hotel, just like they went to the hotel with Sheriff Jones. The first thing they did was clean out all the liquor in the basement. Because you know, if you are in the military and you're going into battle, you have to be a little bit drunk, or you have to be stoned, or you have to be something, because you're probably going to die. And so they were all very drunk, and so were the Sheriff Jones's people, very drunk, because they had to do things that they ordinarily wouldn't do. If you look at the photo of the survivors of Quantrill's raid in Missouri and compare that photo to the survivors of Quantrill's raid in Kansas, you set them side by side, they all look the same. They don't look different at all. So we were killing each other even though we really belong to each other. And that's what happens in Civil War, of course. Well, that's still standing. The Quantrill's raiders met his daughter there on the porch, front porch, and she talked to them, and they went on. They went on, and they saved this. And it was this was a station of the Underground Railroad. There's Charlie Hart, a.k.a. William Quantrill. Looks like a nice young man, school teacher. What's wrong with him? Slavery was what's wrong with him, and he believed in it. And this is the result. This is Massachusetts Street in 1863. It was August 22nd, probably. And this was what's left of the Eldridge House. So this is 7th Street, and this is Massachusetts Street. They did a pretty good job. They killed about 200 men. All of those people are now finally buried in Oak Hill Cemetery. They were first buried in Pioneer Cemetery, which was out here on West Campus. But it wasn't big enough, they didn't think. It was too far out of town, and they wanted to be closer, so they built a cemetery for the bodies of all these men. Okay, here's another theme. So we've done that theme. We got to go fast now. This is the Haskell theme. This is a sketch that Frank O. Marvin did in 1891, August 6, 1891, looking at Haskell from up on top of the hill. Marvin was the first dean of the School of Engineering. His father was chancellor of the university. And Marvin not only was an engineer, he built our sewage system, which was very important. By the way, we settled Lawrence without having a sewer system. You know what that would have been like? Bad. It was bad. It took 50 years to get it started. There was lots of typhoid fever. Most of our wells were spoiled. But we had to have, in order to have a civilization, we had to have a good sewer system. And without it, we were in trouble. But so Marvin designed that sewer system. He also was an excellent artist, an excellent engineer, and you know what? He played organ at the Richard Corley's church. He was a great musician. So Marvin shows us what Haskell might have looked like. Haskell was established in 1884. This was 1891, so it already had a number of buildings up by then, but it was all out there on its own somewhere. We know where that somewhere is. This is the first 3 buildings. When they opened it and brought these kids in, a lot of these kids were 2 years old, and they wouldn't see their families until they were 21. How about that? How about that? Well, they brought these kids in the fall, and the buildings didn't have their heating systems in. They didn't have their boiler systems in. They didn't have the fires going. And so a lot of kids died in that first year. A lot of kids died. And this is what the Haskell babies looked like, and they did die. By the dozens, tens of dozens. And here's where they're buried, out at Haskell. And if you look closely at one of these, you'll see that Johnson Peabody was an Omaha Indian. He was 9 years old. What we tried to do was take the Indian out of the man and make that man, quote unquote, civilized like we were. How do you like that for civilization? Huh? Yeah. Not very good history. But it's all out there, and history does not lie in the landscape generally. It stays, especially in cemeteries. Basically, the program was teach them how to work the way we worked, to not hunt buffalo, to not skin hides, to not go fishing, but to work in farming. We didn't believe that they had the intelligence to do anything other than manual labor, right? We've heard that before. So manual labor, we taught them how to work. We taught them how to dress the way we dress, both men and women. And there were some days of glory there in 1926 when this was built, mostly by the rich Native Americans in Oklahoma who happened to be given worthless land that turned out to be full of oil. And they could buy anything. And they did. And they purchased the construction of this triumphal arch and the stadium behind it as well. So Haskell had days of glory. One of the things Haskell did not like is it considered the wetlands to the south to be sacred ground. It believed that it had buried children and other people who had died. Native Americans died there. And in 1968, I believe, the federal government sold about 650 acres of the Baker wetlands to Baker for $1. And there's always been tension then between Baker and Haskell since that time. And one of the biggest battles came in the 20th century into the 21st century, which was the South Lawrence Traffic Way, which took 20 years to fight over. And you're all familiar with that. I don't have to tell you a lot of information about that, but you can see that this was from the Lawrence Journal-World in the 1950s. Well, actually, I think it was 1970, because Governor Dockin proposed this encirclement of Lawrence. And it was originally supposed to go south of the Wakarusa River, which would have been just fine with Haskell. The problem was, in order to do that, you had to build 2 bridges. Just made it way too expensive. And so the whole battle was whether or not we should have it, whether or not the alignment should be the 38th Street alignment, whether it should be the 35th Street alignment, or even up here, even closer to Haskell. Well, as it turned out, it was the 35th Street alignment which got built. And Haskell fought that all the way, and is still pissed off, I would say, about it, because they considered it sacred. and they protested it. Oops. And they protested it, saying that Agnes the Frog, remember Agnes the Frog? She ran for county commission. That was a joke, but she did get some votes. But they were worried about all these animals, birds, and snakes, and bugs, and that were part of the natural system, which they believed that they were a part of. And so they fought this until in the 21st century, and now we're finishing the four lanes all the way from Iowa Street to the Turnpike. And so that was a big, big blow up, a conflict in Lawrence that we still have not been able to come back into a communal kind of agreement that was necessary. You may think it was necessary, you may not think it is necessary, but that's where we are today. Then there's East Lawrence. East Lawrence was always on the other side of the tracks. When the Immigrant Aid Society group came, they thought they had purchased 300 acres. They had purchased 300 acres, but half of it was already settled by squatters on the east side. And the squatters would not sell their land to the New England Immigrant Aid Society, so they refused to invest in it. Well, it wasn't the best land after all, because it was lowland. It was subject to frequent floods. And a good 5-inch rain, with all the rain coming off the hill, you'd be under 5 feet of water before you knew it, because there was no sewer system, there was no a stormwater system, so it was all on top of the ground. And so it wasn't very good land. It was smaller parcels, it wasn't as expensive, and eventually that's where most of our black population settled after the Civil War, because they could afford it. Also, just because our people who came here were abolitionists before the Civil War didn't mean that they were abolitionists after the Civil War. There was just as much racial prejudice after the Civil War as there was in South Carolina, particularly during the Jim Crow period. So they lived over there kind of in isolation. So by 1900, they were 20% of our population. Now they're less than 5% because they couldn't make it here. There was too much prejudice. They couldn't earn a living here. They could only get $1 a day, maybe if they were lucky, or maybe $1 a week if they were lucky. And they always had to take lowly jobs, always. And you still see that occurring in our history today. But this is East Lawrence. It still is a part of the other. I sometimes say that in 1854, the East Lawrence squatters said no, and East Lawrence has been saying no ever since. Because they have to protect themselves, because they are always under attack. Especially since it didn't look like they were living in a beautiful place. There were slums there, more or less. I can show you what it often looked like. This was in 1929. These show all the degraded and down in the dump housing that happened in East Lawrence. And by the 1950s and 1960s, the city wanted to have urban renewal. And what urban renewal meant was urban destruction. It meant tearing down all those houses and putting in houses that looked more like what white people would like to settle in. And so when you start tearing down houses, you're hitting pretty close to home, so to speak, aren't you? And you're going to fight like the devil to keep them. And they have fought like the devil to keep what they have right now. Because we've had a lot of initiatives to go in and destroy East Lawrence. Okay? This is what some of those rundown houses look like in East Lawrence. That was 1938, I believe, 1938. So these are the rundown houses that didn't fit our approval. I think that's kind of cute, don't you? I mean, I wouldn't mind living there sometimes. I'm not sure that this shanty, well, let me go, there are also shanties like this that weren't so cute. All around, let's go back. All around then, East Lawrence, were black people living who needed work. Shortly after the Civil War was over, Aunt Jane Williams and her husband moved in from Alabama. She was a brilliant businesswoman. Brilliant. And because of Prohibition was part of the Kansas Constitution in 1881, and we didn't get rid of Prohibition until 1948. Do you think we did a good job? Well, maybe. But, Prohibition in the country was only 1920 till 1933. But what that meant was the Constitution said you can't make it and you can't sell liquor, except for medicinal and mechanical reasons. Medicinal reasons meant that every pharmacist could sell liquor to white people if they could afford it. That meant that very many black people, they couldn't make it, but they could ship it in, they could haul it, they could drink it. Aunt Jane Williams said, well, shoot, Missouri is right over there, doesn't have Prohibition, we'll just ship in all the liquor from Missouri, which she did on the special train. She then put it in warehouses right by where the Santa Fe Depot was, because you could store it. You could also haul it, her husband hauled it down to the middle of a red light district right here. And the center of it was 8th and Pennsylvania. All these circles here, those are all speakeasies. Aunt Jane knew exactly how to do this. She had a great place. She could run all of these organizations. She could bring in money. And you know what? Lawrence didn't have any money to run its city government because it had blown it all on railroad bonds, which were lost in 1873 with that downturn. What did Lawrence do? Every month they arrested her, took her into the jail, and made her pay a big fine. She had more cash than anybody else in town. So she would give them $400 or something like that, and her organization would continue to run, and then she would go home the next morning, and they could pay the mayor, the street commissioner, the fireman, the policeman, and in fact, they were all in on this together. 11 of these houses were owned by Judge Menger. Judge Menger was very famous because if you didn't pay your rent, he just took your front door off. You paid your rent pretty quickly. And by the way, all of this information was completely available for all these years, but we didn't have these search engines to look through the newspapers. Now, I had search engines. I could look through the newspapers and people said, you'll never find anything out about the red light district. Well, my researcher sent me a stack of stuff on the red light district that big. And there were 6 newspapers going at certain times, so it was all corroborated. So this red light district called the East Bottoms, it wasn't called the Bottoms for nothing, it was the Bottoms. And it was only about 15 feet above sea level, higher than the river itself. So we had about 20 major floods since 1825 to 1951. Maybe you remember the 1951 flood. Well, this was just covered in water, in floods. So nobody wanted to go there, except everybody wanted to know about it because it was really juicy. And you could go in at night. And Aunt Jane Williams had the best restaurant in town. It was full when restaurants that were legitimate on Massachusetts Street were not full. So she was a very special person, and she helped us run our city for about 40 years. And then they ran her out of town, and we don't know what happened to her. But Jane Williams was very important. Boy, we're getting close. So a lot of these people, of course, there was liquor lubricated everything. That was the key. Food was the key too. There was some prostitution, because a lot of young women couldn't make enough money to live, and so they prostituted themselves, including Langston Hughes' aunt, which he writes about in Not Without Laughter. If you haven't read that novel, Not Without Laughter, I really recommend it, because it's beautifully written, and he lived right there with his grandma, right in the red light district, and he worked in the hotels as a boot black. And he says, look, all people came here for one reason, to have fun, and we were all the same. And it was the only place in Lawrence that was totally integrated. Totally integrated. The rest of it, if you went down Massachusetts Street, you couldn't go in most buildings if you were black. But everybody could go there, and just about everybody did, including J.D. Bowersock and Mr. Henley and Mr. Watkins, and all those people eventually got down in this place. And I'm not suggesting that they went to one of these shacks, but I'm saying that there were lots of these shacks down there. Okay, let's see how much. Yes, we're still talking about East Lawrence. There were two big initiatives in the 20th century that tried to destroy East Lawrence and split it. The first one was the Haskell Loop. It took 6 years to be defeated, and it was defeated. The second one then was, the reason it was defeated is because they were going after homes. And people will fight to the death for their homes, right? They will. So that was the Haskell Loop's purpose. Get rid of all those ugly homes. The second one was the Eastern Parkway corridor, which was a little bit farther east. And that took 12 years to fight and to win. The reason both of those lost is because they came in from the east. They wanted to connect Highway 10 traffic to the turnpike. They wanted to get across the river. The problem was that they didn't have enough money for the bridge. And they dumped all of their traffic right at 7th and New Hampshire. That's as far as they got. 7th and New Hampshire. That's the same thing that the Haskell Loop did. They dumped all their traffic right there. And so it just could not be brought into being, because the traffic was not going to be doing anything but destroying that East Lawrence. And East Lawrence fought this to the death practically. Race. We've been talking about race. This is a woman who came with her husband from Arkansas in 1863. She had 3 boys. They all went to KU. One was a lawyer, one was a physician, one was a farmer, and they all went to KU. So we had these people who came in and took advantage of what they could, but it was hard. This is Nash Walker. He was one of the most famous Lawrenceans of that time. He was a vaudeville artist, and he was born in 1873 in